Welcome everyone to LSAT Insights number 13. Today I'm going to more explicitly discuss something that I've brought up at different angles at different times. But one thing, if you follow my content that you're aware of, is that I am not a very big fan of technique. I haven't thus far, though, been very explicit about what exactly I replace technique with in my own study and my own instruction, and that's what we're going to discuss here today. So, on several occasions, like I said, I've made clear my disdain for technique-driven approaches, but perhaps I've been a little bit less explicit about what I emphasize in place of technique, which I try to put under the catch-all banner that I've called objective here. So today I'll cover what I think technique is, what I think objective is, and an analogy that hopefully helps to clarify the difference between those two concepts. And so starting with technique. Broadly speaking, I define technique as the actual method of executing specific tasks on this exam. Examples of this include learning how to recognize and respond to specific logical patterns, for instance, necessity versus sufficiency, relative versus absolute, etc., in LR stimuli, or the practice of highlighting keywords or phrases while reading RC passages, or using recommended diagrams when setting up different types of LG games. So the good things about technique. A certain amount of technique is admittedly necessary to perform well on the exam. If you simply don't know how to do or perform key things in LG, RC, or LR, it's hard to imagine that you'll ever improve your performance. There is a downside to a technique-heavy approach, though. There's a lot of techniques that you can learn or develop. This might be fine for PTs that you take in the comfort of your usual safe study space, but the stress of the horrendously poorly proctored actual exam these days seems quite good at degrading your ability to power through on technique alone. And technique alone, speaking of which, that's actually the core problem. It's not technique itself, it's the fact that technique tends to absorb and take all the breath out of the room, and it's really the only thing that people focus on. Focusing on technique alone is really what the problem is. Techniques are merely tools that you engage to achieve various objectives, and learning those techniques are only half the battle. So, what I'm going to call objective, as you might have guessed, is the other half the battle that I referenced at the end of the previous slide. So if techniques comprise the set of tools you need to successfully execute various tasks on this exam, then objective refers to your ability to recognize and stay focused on the key task you actually want to perform. And thereby, you'll be able to decide the most appropriate tools to use. Recognizing the key task. Well, I mean, arguably, can't that just be another set of techniques? Can't I teach you a technique to recognize the key task? Short answer is no. What I'm calling objective here is it's much more akin to a fundamental attitude towards each section that allows you to keep sufficient focus on why you're working so hard in the first place, not learning how to perform that work more proficiently. So again, technique is about the second bit, performing the actual work that you want to get done. But the objective part focuses on what work you actually want to do and why you want to get it done. Those are, to me, prior and more important questions. So these fundamental attitudes, the good news is that they're far simpler than techniques. Techniques can get pretty complicated, and they've got all sorts of names and fancy use cases and whatnot. The fundamental attitudes that are underpinning the objective-based approach that I'm about to describe, it's pretty simple. It's pretty low IQ. I've been thinking up various analogies, and this is one that I found to be fairly applicable and helpful to my students. So hopefully it'll be helpful to you guys too. Uh, Here's a basic scenario. You and I are working colleagues. Let's just say we're at the same law firm, and you need to get me a message. That's the scenario. You have four basic techniques to get in touch with me. Email, very common. Text, I guess if we have that kind of working relationship. Phone call, less common, but again, something that we still do these days. And finally, actually coming up to me and talking to me in person. So, a technique-centric approach to the problem of needing to communicate with me might look like this. It would focus first on the tools that you have to communicate with me. And I just told you about what those four tools were on the previous slide, right? You'd focus on those tools instead of the end goal of actually successfully communicating with me. If all you initially care about is transmitting the information to me until you get a response acknowledging that I received it, you could, theoretically, just start with a tool you're most comfortable with and just hope it works. You could do that. If that doesn't work, you could just move to the next tool and next one, et cetera, until at some point I say, all right, I got the message, stop spamming. You don't really care under a technique-centric approach how or why you're trying to get in touch with me. You just know that X technique worked in the past, and you're just going to keep doing it until it works today as well. At the end of the day, such a technique-centric approach can certainly achieve your end goal. I probably will get the message at some point, but you probably spent more time and energy than necessary getting the job done. And to put it another way, it doesn't really matter how awesome you are at texting if I'm not going to look at my phone for the rest of the day. Getting even better at texting does exactly nothing to fix that problem. So this kind of inefficiency, honestly, it might not mean that much in this analogy since, maybe you had a whole workday to get me the message perhaps, and each individual tool, email, text, phone call, whatever, those individual tools are easy enough to use, not brain surgery. But on the exam, this kind of inefficiency can build up and can end up torpedoing the entire fourth game you get to, fourth passage, or those late section LR stimuli at the end of an LR section. This builds up and it does deny you questions that I think you'd otherwise get right if you had more energy to do it, time and energy really. So what would an objective centric approach look like in the same scenario? An objective centric approach would first focus on the overall end goal of communicating with me. And I think that would mean that you'd ask a completely different set of questions when determining what to do. Before even thinking about which communication tool to use, you'd probably try to figure out where I am and what I'm doing. If I'm based on your knowledge of my commute on the train to the office, you might decide to text me because there's a good chance I'm looking at my phone, as we all do when we're on the train these days. If I'm in a meeting in the office that you just can't barge into, and the message isn't all that urgent, you'll probably just rattle off an email that you know I'll get to later when I get out of the meeting. The moral of the story here is that each tool that you have doesn't drive your decision, and each tool is pretty low IQ and doesn't automatically achieve your goal just because you know how to use it. Instead, you're looking at the overall scenario, what objective you want to achieve within that scenario, then selecting the appropriate tool to engage. If you stay focused enough on the objective, you might even figure out how to get the job done with something other than the typical tools you're used to and do it all on the fly. So again, to kind of build on what I was just talking about with the flexibility opened up, here is yet another twist on the same scenario. Um, I'm meeting with an important client at their office across town, and you know I make a point of turning off my phone's ringer or vibration and putting it well out of sight during meetings to minimize distraction, demonstrate 100% focus on the client. By the way, that is actually what I do in practice. Um, Unfortunately, the message that you need to get to me is urgent, and you don't really have the time or means to get across town physically to that meeting spot, probably the client's office, right? I think that's what I said. Yeah, client's office to get to where I'm at. One possible objective-based approach that you might make is this. You would call the front desk of wherever I'm at. Let them know who you are, who I am, what I'm doing there, and that there's an urgent but confidential matter you need to talk to me about. So if they ask you, hey, I'll just get in the message, really, no, no, it's a client matter. I can't really just tell anybody. I've got to talk to James directly. Hopefully, the reception staff who takes your call would know best how to get my attention in that meeting and let me know that there's something urgent that I need to talk to you about. Notice that the technique you actually used was a mixture and transformation of two standard techniques from the very first slide of this analogy. You used phone call, not even, you weren't even calling my phone. You called the client's front desk. And you mixed that with in-person contact, and it wasn't even you going to see me in person. It was that receptionist or whoever else, the office assistant, going to, poke their head into the meeting room, like, hey, sorry to interrupt. James, you got a call, you got to take it. Something like that. So really, it's not it wasn't in your original list of things that you know how to do, but you were still able to build up to it. I want to emphasize the importance of this is that this is not genius of any kind. It's really low IQ. It's something pretty much any functioning professional adult can be more than expected to be capable of doing. It's not hard stuff. And that is the true value of the objective approach. By putting your goals ahead of the tools you can use to achieve those goals, you can give yourself room to more wisely engage or even alter on the fly your tools to, in fact, better achieve those goals. So again, it's not anything rocket sciencey or too complex. It's just simply, hey, when I focus first on what it is that I actually want to do or get done, what is my goal here, and then engage the tool that best fits that goal, that works better. For the most part, you guys, especially those who are crunched for time before the January exam, which is right around the corner, um, A lot of you guys email me about just basically this mad scramble to learn as many techniques as possible. And admittedly, like I said, that does need to be part of it, but it's not going to get you that nice fat 170 plus goal score, especially in the amount of time that you have. You've got to have some amount of flexibility. And I think this objective centric approach hopefully demonstrates how you can start with the same set of techniques, but just with a slight tweak to your thinking, you can arrive at something much more flexible than the original tools that you. So how does this actually play out on the exam, outside of this weird analogy that I just put up? You've seen this objective-centric approach at work in all of my existing content. It's part of the flowchart thing that I recently released for LG. By the way, I still feel not so great about that one because again, it's something of a violation of my principles, but I'll leave that for a different discussion. Sometimes you want to refer to previous work. Sometimes it's a rule you've butted up against repeatedly. Other times you have to grind out answer choices. These are all techniques, right? However, the most important goal that I have in LG is to pick an answer based on the information that I have available, not mindlessly grind out world after world. And because that's my goal, I'm constantly flowing back to different techniques, different choices. At this point, like I finished a diagram for C. Do I need to keep going to D and E, or do I actually know this is correct? That's dominating my thought when it comes to LG. Not, I got to finish this world or I got to just pump out more diagrams. That's not really how it works for me. In RC, my dismissive reading of each passage is a direct outgrowth of this objective approach. The most important goal that I figured out for myself is to learn the logical core of the passage and not to understand all the details. And you've heard me say it X number of times if you've been following my RC content at all. But remember, for me and the way I teach RC, understanding what something is not important. That doesn't ever seem to be the goal. You have to understand why it's there and what it's doing there, and that's what I'm referring to by logical core. It's what these concepts are doing, what are they performing on the exam, not what is this concept itself. And because that's my goal, I don't actually have to spend all that much time reading and really getting into the weeds about these details. In LR, when I set my primary goal as finding a deficiency in every argument, I can even handle those pesky science stimuli where the argument actually looks fine to me, and thus I have to resort to using the general form of the assumption to make progress. And this is the subject of a recent video that I've uploaded as well, in terms of assumption types. Note here that I'm not completely abandoning technique. As I've mentioned a couple times already, technique is a necessary part of the exam. You have to know how to do things on the exam. It's just that I'm choosing to use particular techniques after deciding on what my primary objective is. I'm not just, headless chicken running around just trying everything that works or the one thing that I know is works for the most question and just trying that again, failing. That's not how I do things. If you're in the mid 160s range already, you likely know just about every technique that you need for the exam. What you must do at this point is learn how to use your techniques more efficiently. For those of you who are still below that mid 160s range, keep learning techniques. Like I've said several times already, you do need to know how to do XYZ task, whatever it is on the exam. I do teach a handful of techniques, and most other LSAT prep sources teach a lot more than I do. But once you've got a technical grasp of the exam, and by that I mean you can break 160 on an untimed PT, that's a good time to start focusing on shifting to this objective-centric approach to kind of fill the remaining gaps. So in terms of takeaways, let me try to be as efficient as possible here. Technique matters, but never lose sight of your objective on any given question. That should drive what technique you want to use. Now, at this point, you might be asking, well, can you teach me what all these right objectives are? And honestly, I could compile a pretty comprehensive list of objectives that, for X number of scenarios on all three of the sections. But currently, I'm going to flatly refuse to do so because I sincerely believe it'll do more harm than good. Because one of the greatest forms of flexibility that the LSAC retains is just the flexibility of human language, of the English language, right? They can choose to express a similar thing in a stupidly obscure, new, different way, and all of a sudden, the old patterns might not be that recognizable. Chances are, if you're getting even half of the medium and high difficulty questions right at this point, there's a number of scenarios where you are indeed keeping your eye properly on the objective first and the technique second. That means you kind of know how to do it correctly already. There's no need to fix what isn't broken. For everything else, it's surprisingly personal as to what specific language or framing works best for you in terms of defining objectives that are useful to you. Really, it boils down to email me if you're completely lost on something. I should be able to point you in the right direction. We probably don't even need like a full consultation even to get that done. Just send me an email like, hey, I saw your thing on objectives. I'm looking at this passage or I'm looking at this stimulus. I'm looking at this game. What should be my objective here? I'm confused. What should I do? All I'm thinking of is various techniques and it's not helping me. I should be able to help you with that if it's targeted enough. And of course, that brings us to the end. As usual, thanks for watching. I'm James. This is my email address. Let me know if you have further questions, but otherwise, thanks for being here, and I will see you in the next one.